Alyssa, what's on your radar?
So this past week, the country was gripped by the disappearance of Gabby Petito, a beautiful 22-year-old girl with the world at her fingertips. Gabby, like many Gen Zers, documents her life and travels on social media. It made people following her case feel connected to her and desperately want to help. TikToks, Reddit threads, YouTubers, and other internet sleuths came out of the woodwork in droves to try to find clues and ultimately to try to crack the case. The story had everything that draws people to the now multi-billion-dollar industry of true crime. They were young, they were pretty, they were in love, they had an Instagram-worthy life, but something went wrong. Now, as we all tragically learned earlier this week, remains believed to be Gabby's were found in the picturesque Wyoming National Park. It's awful. My heart aches for her and her family, and I pray that justice is served and they find peace. I want to be clear, the death of a young woman is a terrible tragedy and no equivocation should be made around it. But it raises reminders of a tragic and systemic evil that continues to plague our great nation, especially across the heartland, the plight of missing and murdered Indigenous women. A stunning report from the Seattle Indian Health Board released in 2018 documented more than 500 cases of missing or murdered Indigenous women, but hinted at a far greater magnitude, particularly in the Western United States. One NBC headline starkly puts it, quote, "No one knows how many Indigenous women are murdered each year. That makes the deaths hard to stop." Further, available data suggests more than 4 out of 5 American Indian women will experience violence in their lifetime, according to a 2016 National Institute of Justice study. These statistics are devastating and tragically barely break through in the mainstream media. The issue itself is complex and is a result of a mixture of law enforcement failures, tribal jurisdictional disputes, and a lack of focus on the root causes of the violence. As NBC notes, addressing the patchwork of criminal jurisdictions in Indian country, which requires prosecutors and sometimes law enforcement to determine whether tribes, the state or federal government, whether the state or federal government has authority in a case, is already difficult. But it's an even more daunting task when law enforcement doesn't even know how many cases exist. The Trump administration attempted to tackle the issue with the signing of Executive Order 13898, which established a presidential task force on missing and murdered American Indians and Alaska Natives. The task force goes by the name Operation Lady Justice and is a joint operation between the Department of Justice, the Department of the Interior, and Health and Human Services. The task force issued its first report at the end of the Trump administration, and it works with tribes, individuals, and stakeholder groups established to convene 10 working groups to address specific mandates, including developing protocols, solving cold cases, and expanding outreach and awareness. At the time, former Attorney General Bill Barr rightly noted that the situation is all the more tragic in light of the generations of trauma already suffered by Indigenous people. Now, the Biden administration is building on that work. Secretary of the Interior Deb Haaland, the first Native American to hold the position, has called for the establishment of a special unit within the Bureau of Indian Affairs dedicated to addressing missing and murdered Indigenous women. But the issue isn't new. In fact, it's been going on since the founding of our nation. But the renewed attention on it within the federal government gives me hope that we may be able to solve it within our lifetime. I raise this today because in Wyoming, where the nation's eyes were glued as police desperately searched for Gabby Petito, at least 710 Indigenous people, mostly girls, went missing from 2011 to 2020, according to a January report published by the state's Missing and Murdered Indigenous People Task Force. Wind River is the only reservation in the state, but the report found Indigenous people have been reported missing in 22 out of the 23 counties in Wyoming, making it a statewide problem. The same report looked at media coverage and found that only 30% of Indigenous homicide victims made the news, compared to 51% of white victims. These statistics are tragic and point to an overall failing of both our media and society to often view tragedies involving minorities or the disadvantaged differently. Gabby's death was an unthinkable tragedy, but so were the cases of the 710 missing and Indigenous girls and women in Wyoming. So Ryan, Joy Reid actually sounded off on this, someone I don't often agree with or give a ton of credit to, but she did make the point that this is something that's been going on for decades, and it barely breaks through in the mainstream media. And frankly, there was a movie, Wind River, made that I think actually, for the first time, put it on so many people's radar. How is this not a bigger issue?
Well, and I think the phenomenon of the rise of the true crime podcasts and dramas, plays into this as well. I think people here had the sense that they were witnessing one of these narratives play out in real time, and there was something tragic and exciting about that at the same time. And Matt Crispin, a co-host of Chavo Trap House, has talked about the phenomenon of how our sense of powerlessness kind of fuels a lot of our pathologies and our pathological behavior. And I think that actually applies in this case here, that there's just this sense that there's no ability for us to do anything collectively as a people to solve any of these broader social problems. And so then we channel those impulses into the pop culture entertainment of true crime drama, or in following these types of these types of true crime dramas playing out in real life, because anything else feels almost worse than pointless, because you're just going to bang your head against the wall, and so it's easier to just not care.
I think that's very accurate. I mean, as somebody who myself is a true crime fan, there is, when the story fits what you look for in a storyline, like the Gabby case did, it's easier for people to follow, and they really do feel invested and like they think they can help. And I don't discredit that. There have been certainly cases of, cold cases getting solved because people looked back into them, just outside viewers who wanted to get to the bottom of it. But what's so tough on this issue is with, missing in Indigenous women, or murdered, I should say, in many cases, it doesn't have those elements that draw into, the mainstream 21st century American psyche that's interesting to them. They're not on Instagram accounts. They don't necessarily look like the people who are consuming it, and therefore people just stop caring about it. And I'm hoping that this renewed focus by the federal government at least does something. I think that it certainly helps that we've got a Secretary of the Interior who herself is a Native American woman and can draw attention to this issue. But it's also remarkable, the statistic I mentioned about how underreported it is in the media. And I think the same thing could be said as well about, deaths within the African American community that just don't break through in the same way that they would if it's a white person who's murdered in the exact same part of town. It's devastating.
Yeah, and interestingly and increasingly, a lot of them are now on these social media platforms, but their circles don't overlap with the ones that overlap with people who are in the media. So you might even have viral phenomena going on in particular communities, but it's just completely missed by the media because it doesn't intersect with their community.
Exactly. Well, and we have Team Rising joining us next.